Ralph Gordon, I met him later in life. Incredible guy. I met him, and he was difficult to get in touch with. I was putting together the 60th anniversary for the Squadron, and I was trying to get all the living Squadron COs to come up to Trenton. And we knew he was still alive. We knew he lived down in Florida, but had a tough time. So called him up, finally got through to him, and he said, Tim, I'm sorry about that. I was out on the boat for a bit. And I said, oh, you got a boat? And he said, yeah, I've got a sailboat. And I said, great. Where were you sailing? And he said, oh, around Cuba. He was 80. And I said, wow, that's breathtaking. And he said, yeah, we were good for a bit, and then we snagged a fishing net, and we were out in the middle of the ocean. We snagged the fishing net, and it just fouled us up. We weren't going anywhere. I said, oh, well, what'd you do about that? And he said, well, I dove underwater, got a knife, and I cut us free. And I said, 80. So that was Ralph Gordon, and that was his start. But he's not the story I want to tell you about. I want to tell you about a corporal that was overseas in the Second World War in Burma. And his name was Art Adams. Now, Art became a really, really good friend of mine as well. And Art was known as the Brick Bomber. Now, here's Art's story. Here's one of those micro stories of the people that I think you should hear, the heroes that Canada needs to aspire to be. So in Burma, as the Canadian Army was pushing the Japanese back, they were pushing back very, very, very quickly. The only way of getting supplies to them was using 436 Squadron, who would fly low and slow in the Dakota. And they'd kick the supplies out the side of the door and paradrop them into the troops. The Army was doing a very, very good job, so it created what was called a long, narrow salient. So this was the path that led to our troops. They were going so quickly it became really, really long and really narrow. And 436 would fly along that. And Dick Denison, who was the deputy commanding officer of the squadron at the time, this was in March of 1945, he said to Art, he said, you know, those boys, they've been living on field rations for a long time. They must be hungry for some good food. And Art said, well, you know, I bet they are. And please know, my friends in green, this is a story about the testimony of how we in the Air Force, we do have sympathy for you sometimes as we sleep in our warm beds and drink our cold beer. But so Dick said, you know what? I bet you those Army fellows, they'd appreciate a good hot-cooked meal. And Art said, well, I bet they would. And so Dick said, well, what they need then is a field kitchen. And if they're going to have a field kitchen, they need bricks. So we can build them a field kitchen. We can take out the bricks and we can build them a field kitchen with a good wood-fired stove. And Art said, I bet we can. And so Dick said, all right, you know what, I'm going to file the flight plan. Art, there's a pile of bricks over there. I want you to load them on the plane. He said, how much do you think a brick weighs? And he said, I don't know, about 2 pounds, I guess. And he said, all right, 2 pounds. So we can take 1,000 of those bricks. So go load 2,000 of those bricks out, and we'll fly them out, and we'll build them a field kitchen. He said, okay. So Art went and he loaded the bricks on. And Dick came and said, we're ready to go. We're ready to go. So they hopped on the plane. They hopped in the Dakota. The Dakota's a tail dragger, and went out to the button of the runway. And Dick said, all right, let's go. And they took off, and they went down the runway. Well, halfway down the runway, the back was still on the ground. That's not a good thing. So Dick, he hits the brakes, and he turns around, and he goes back, and he said, geez, let's try that again. So he puts the brakes on full. He puts the power on, and the wings are rattling, and the engines are shuddering, and he pops the brakes off, and this thing goes down the runway, and it hits just after the half, and the tail just starts to come up, and he's pushing forward on the stick, and he gets to the end of the runway, and this thing starts to gradually climb. And it could only make it up to about 250 feet. It was just so overloaded. And so as they're flying along, Art's in the back, and Dick's in the front. And they're flying over a cove, and they saw in this cove, in this island, a Japanese seaplane. It's the enemy. And so Art radioed up to the front, and he got on the intercom, and he said, permission to offload a few bricks. And so Dick said, permission granted. And they circled around. And Art was furiously flinging these bricks out of this Japanese plane. You son of a, I'll get you. And Dick said, I think we've offloaded enough, and they continued en route. And when they landed the plane, they landed it light as a feather. Well, years later, Art was telling me that story, and he said, Tim, I weighed a brick after we landed. And he said, you know what a brick weighs, Tim? And I said, no, Art, what? And he said, 3 pounds exactly. I said, oh, so you thought they weighed 2 pounds, and you loaded 1,000 because that was your maximum. So you were actually 1,000 pounds overweight on that plane. And he said, yeah. And he said, if we hadn't have got rid of those bricks, there's no way on earth we would have survived that landing. The plane would have crashed. And I said, oh, that's cool. But I said, Art, no one really cares about that. And he said, no? And I said, no. I said, you know what we care about? And he said, what? Did you get the plane? And so it was interesting that it was like decades later that Art and I, he was going through a library, and it was a military library. And in this library was a book. And in this book was a picture. And it was a picture of a Japanese seaplane that had canvas-covered wings, and they were all shredded, and they were surrounded by piles of bricks. And the caption said, unknown damage to and so it was decades later, like it was in the 2000s, that we finally learned that Art Adams, the brick bomber, 436 Squadron, actually had a confirmed kill in the Second World War. And that's the story of Art Adams, the brick bomber. It was wonderful to meet him, and it was incredible to watch as he slowly, in his mid-80s, would walk hesitantly up to the stage. And then as he started to tell the story, I would watch the decades fall off until the end. He was laughing and laughing and laughing as he told the story. So tonight, as we continue with stories, I want you to remember that. We are surrounded by heroes. And because we're Canadians, those heroes are awfully quiet. Do you know, it brings back one more story that I want to share with you as I started my own career in the military. I had a stereotypical send-off in the military. I joined in Hamilton, Ontario. And when I joined the military, my entire family came down to the train station to see me off, just like you'd see in the movies. There was my grandmother, my mother, my brother, my mom, and my dad. And my dad took me aside before we got on the train. He said, Tim, I've got some advice to tell you. Now, fellas, you'll know this is the moment we all dream of. When your dad takes you aside for that talk. And he said, I want to pass on to you some advice, Tim. And I thought, oh, this is it. This is the moment I get the keys to the universe. Every boy dreams of it. So he takes me aside and he said, so I want to share with you 2 things. He said, the first thing is this. Change your razor blade once a week, okay? And I thought, oh, okay. That's practical. So he's still giving me the keys to the universe. The first one's a practical thing. The other one's a philosophical thing. I'm positive. Okay, Dad. Change razor blade once a week. I got it. I said, what's the other thing? He said, all right, so the other thing, son, is, never refuse an offered breath mint, okay? And with that, he sent me off to find my way in the world and become a man. Now, what's funny is that years later, I became a prime speaker for the Air Force Speakers Bureau, and the week around November the 11th would be really, really busy for me. But because I was in Trenton, back in Ontario again, where my dad was living, my dad came to every single presentation I made. And I'd sit and watch him filled with pride in the back of the room. And I have to tell you, it doesn't matter how old you are as a man, to see your dad filled with pride because of something you're doing is the nicest feeling on earth. And I would tell that story at the beginning of every presentation that I made. And it was about maybe 6 months into the storytelling and the presentations that I was doing that as I was watching my dad, it occurred to me what he was actually saying. He was Canadian. In Canada, we don't openly say things like, I love you and I'm proud of you. Instead, what we say is, change your razor blade once a week and don't refuse an offered breath mint. That's what we say. So, I want to leave you with that thought as we talk about remembrance. And I remember my dad, and I remember Art Adams, and I remember Dick Denison, and I remember Ralph Gordon. Canadian heroes that we should be proud of. Thanks.